The chill in the courtroom had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a cold that seeped into my bones, a frost that emanated from the two people who were supposed to be my warmest refuge, my mother and father. I stood for a moment just inside the heavy wooden doors, my sensible shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. Across the room, I saw them. My father, Arthur, in his Sunday best suit, looking stiff and impatient. My mother, Margaret, beside him, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield, her expression a careful mask of weary disappointment. As my eyes met theirs, I saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement. A shared glance, and then the synchronized, dismissive roll of their eyes. It was a gesture I knew better than my own reflection. It was the gesture that had defined my 57 years. I was Eleanor, the dreamer, the sentimental one, the daughter who had never quite measured up. And in their eyes, this courtroom, this desperate last stand, was just another of my foolish, emotional whims. They thought I was about to embarrass myself, to crumble under the weight of legal jargon and professional authority. But as I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and stale coffee filling my lungs, I looked towards the elevated bench. The judge, a woman with kind eyes but a firm set to her mouth, glanced up. She didn't know me. She didn't know the lifetime of quiet dismissals I carried on my shoulders. And in that moment, I held on to a sliver of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she would be the first one to see me for who I truly was. My life had not been one of grand achievements, at least not the kind my parents could boast about at their bridge club. My older brother, Robert, was the star of our family. He was a successful financial advisor, with a sharp mind for numbers and a portfolio that made my father puff out his chest with pride. Robert had a beautiful wife, 2 children in prestigious universities, and a house with a 3-car garage. He was solid, dependable, logical. I, on the other hand, had become a librarian. I had found my solace not in stock markets, but in the hushed aisles of the local library, in the stories of lives lived between the pages of forgotten books. I had married a kind man, a history teacher named David, and we had built a small, quiet life filled with books, long walks, and the gentle rhythm of shared contentment. We never had children, a fact my mother never failed to mention with a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken criticisms. Our life was simple, and to my parents, simple was a synonym for failed. The source of this frigid courtroom battle was not a business or a fortune, but something far more precious. It was my grandmother, Beatrice, and the patch of earth she called home, Blackwood Creek Farm. The farm wasn't a sprawling, profitable enterprise. It was a rambling collection of 70 acres, a creaking 2-story house with a porch swing, a barn that leaned just a little to the north, and a field of wildflowers that Beatrice insisted was more valuable than any cash crop. I had spent the summers of my childhood there, chasing fireflies, learning to identify birds by their songs, and listening to Beatrice's stories. She was the keeper of our family's history, not the polished, presentable history my parents preferred, but the real, messy, beautiful truth. She would sit with me on that porch swing, her hands busy shelling peas or mending a tear in my jeans, and she would talk. She told me about growing up during the Depression, about the husband she loved and lost too soon, about the simple joys of a good harvest and the quiet sorrow of a winter storm. She would always say, "Ellie, this land isn't just dirt and fences. It's memory. Every tree, every stone, it remembers us." And she made me promise. It wasn't a formal, dramatic event. It was a quiet afternoon, the air thick with the smell of honeysuckle. She was in her late 80s then, her mind still sharp as a tack, but her body beginning to betray her. She took my hand, her skin as soft and thin as parchment. "Promise me, Eleanor," she'd whispered, her voice steady. "Promise me I'll see my last sunset from this porch. Don't let them put me away in one of those sterile, white places where everyone forgets your name." I had looked into her clear blue eyes, the same color as the cornflowers that grew wild by the creek, and I had promised. "I promise, Grandma. I promise." But time is a relentless thief. Over the last few years, Beatrice had begun to fade. It started subtly. A forgotten name here, a repeated story there. Then it became more pronounced. She would get lost on the way back from the mailbox. She would put the milk in the cupboard and the sugar in the refrigerator. The vibrant, storytelling woman I knew was becoming a ghost in her own home, haunted by the fragments of a life she could no longer piece together. I started spending more and more time at the farm, helping her with meals, managing her medications, sitting with her in the long, quiet afternoons as her mind drifted through the fog of dementia. There were good days, moments of breathtaking clarity when she would look at me and smile, a flash of the old Beatrice shining through. "Oh, Ellie," she'd say, "I was just dreaming of your grandfather." And for a few precious minutes, she would be back with me. But those moments became rarer, islands of lucidity in an ever-widening ocean of confusion. The crisis came to a head 3 months ago. Robert, on one of his infrequent, dutiful visits, found Beatrice wandering in the wildflower field in her nightgown, convinced she was a little girl again, waiting for her father to come home from the war. He called me, his voice sharp with a mixture of panic and accusation. "This has gone too far, Ellie. She's a danger to herself. We can't let this continue." A family meeting was called at my parents' house. It felt less like a discussion and more like a verdict being delivered. Robert had spreadsheets and brochures. He had researched the top-rated memory care facilities in the state. "Look," he said, tapping a glossy page. "The Evergreen Meadows. It has a 24-hour nursing staff, structured activities, gourmet meals. It's the best option. It's the only logical option." My father nodded in agreement. "Robert's right, Eleanor. Your grandmother needs professional care. What you're doing is admirable, but it's not sustainable. It's sentiment, not sense." "And the farm?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Robert exchanged a look with our father. "I've already spoken to a developer," he said, his tone brisk and businesslike. "The land is prime for a new housing development. Selling it would more than cover the cost of Evergreen Meadows for the rest of her life. It's the financially responsible thing to do." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sell the farm. The place that held our history, our memories. The place Beatrice loved more than anything. "No," I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Absolutely not. I made a promise." My mother sighed, that long-suffering sound that always made me feel about 10 years old. "Eleanor, be reasonable. Promises made to someone who is no longer fully there, they don't hold the same weight. We have to think about what's best for her now. What's best for her is to be home." I insisted, my voice rising. "What's best for her is to be surrounded by things she knows, to be cared for by family, not strangers in a sterile hallway." That's what she wanted. That's what she asked me for. The argument raged for hours. They called me selfish for wanting to keep her in a declining state just to soothe my own conscience. They called me naive for thinking I could handle the increasing demands of her care. They said I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment, that I was clinging to a past that was gone. Every word was a confirmation of their lifelong opinion of me, the impractical, emotional daughter who couldn't be trusted to make a sensible decision. Finally, defeated and heartbroken, I said the only thing I could. "I won't let you do it. I'll fight you." And that is how we ended up here. They had filed a petition for guardianship, citing Beatrice's cognitive decline and my inability to provide adequate care or manage her financial affairs responsibly. They had a high-priced lawyer, a man in a tailored suit who looked as slick and polished as my brother. I had my savings, which were dwindling fast on my own legal counsel, a kind but overworked public interest lawyer who had warned me our chances were slim. The court, he said, almost always sided with the path of least resistance, which was professional care. But as the day approached, I made a decision. I told my lawyer I wanted to speak for myself. He advised against it, but I was insistent. This wasn't a battle of legal precedents, it was a battle for a person's soul. And only I could truly speak for Beatrice's. That decision was the final straw for my parents. It was the ultimate act of foolishness, the peak of my sentimental, self-destructive nature. And it was why, when I walked into that courtroom, they rolled their eyes, already certain of the outcome. They were just waiting for the judge to confirm what they had known all along, that I, Eleanor, was wrong. I made my way to the simple wooden table designated for my side of the room. I sat down and placed a worn, cardboard file box on the floor beside me. It wasn't full of legal documents or financial statements. It was full of memories. I felt the weight of my family's gaze from across the aisle, a palpable pressure of disapproval. The proceedings began. Their lawyer stood up, a man named Mr. Davies, and he began to speak in a smooth, confident tone. He painted a picture of a loving family, deeply concerned for the welfare of their matriarch. He presented medical reports from doctors who had seen Beatrice for a single 30-minute evaluation, their clinical language reducing her to a series of deficits and symptoms. He spoke of her cognitive impairment, her inability to perform daily tasks, her significant risk of self-harm. He made her sound like a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated. Then he turned his attention to me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were carefully chosen, each one a subtle but sharp jab. He portrayed me as a well-meaning but misguided daughter living in a fantasy world. "Miss Vance," he said, using my married name as if to distance me from the family unit, "is driven by an emotional attachment to the past, not the practical realities of the present. Her desire to keep her grandmother on the farm, while born from love, is unfortunately not in Mrs. Beatrice Miller's best interests. Miss Vance has no medical training. The farmhouse is old and not equipped for the needs of an individual with advanced dementia. Her plan is to be blunt, a recipe for disaster." He called my brother, Robert, to the stand. Robert was composed, articulate. He spoke about financial responsibility, about fiduciary duty. He laid out the numbers, the value of the land, the exorbitant cost of in-home care versus the all-inclusive price of evergreen meadows. He spoke of risk mitigation and long-term planning. He never once mentioned the porch swing, or the smell of his grandmother's apple pie, or the story she used to tell him about the stars. He was every bit the successful, logical son my parents adored. When he was asked about my promise to Beatrice, his expression tightened. "My sister is very sentimental," he said, a faint note of pity in his voice. "Grandma said a lot of things over the years. We can't let a nostalgic, off-the-cuff comment from years ago dictate a serious medical and financial decision today. We have to be the adults in the room." The phrase hung in the air. We have to be the adults in the room. The implication was clear. I was the child, clinging to a fairy tale. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up my neck. I looked at my parents. My father was nodding, a proud, affirmative expression on his face. My mother was dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue, a perfect performance of a pained, concerned mother caught in a difficult situation. They were a united front of pragmatism, and I was the lone, emotional outlier. The whole morning was a slow, methodical dismantling of my position, of my love, of my promise. They were building a case, brick by logical brick, that I was unfit and that my love was a liability. Every piece of testimony, every chart Robert presented, made the walls of the courtroom feel like they were closing in on me. My own lawyer did his best. He questioned Robert about his infrequent visits to the farm before the crisis. He asked my parents if they had ever spent a full 24 hours caring for Beatrice themselves. Their answers were evasive, full of justifications about busy schedules and their own health. But it wasn't enough. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. The judge, Judge Albright, listened patiently to it all, her face betraying nothing. She was an enigma, her gaze steady, her pen occasionally scratching a note on a legal pad. I couldn't tell if she was swayed, bored, or simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion. During the lunch recess, I didn't leave the courthouse. I couldn't face the thought of seeing my family in the hallway. I sat alone on a hard bench, eating a sandwich I didn't taste. The full weight of my potential failure pressed down on me. What if they were right? What if I was being selfish? The doubt, a seed they had planted in my heart decades ago, began to sprout. Maybe I couldn't do this. Maybe caring for Grandma Beatrice at home was too much. The image of her, confused and lost in the field, flashed in my mind. The responsibility was immense, terrifying. Perhaps putting her in a home was the kindest thing, a surrender to the inevitable. I thought about the promise, and for the first time, It felt less like a sacred vow and more like a heavy chain. But then I thought about Beatrice's hands, the way they used to feel in mine. I thought about her laugh, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. I thought about the way she'd look at the sunset from the porch, a look of such profound peace on her face. And I thought about the alternative, a clean, quiet room, a window looking out onto a manicured lawn she didn't know, surrounded by kind but paid strangers who didn't know that she hated the color beige and loved the smell of rain. They wouldn't know that she hummed old show tunes when she was nervous, or that she believed a cup of chamomile tea could solve almost any problem. They would care for her body, yes, but who would care for her soul? The doubt receded, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. I had to try. I owed her that. I owed it to the girl who had spent her summers at Blackwood Creek Farm, and to the woman she had become. When the court reconvened, it was finally my turn. My lawyer gave me an encouraging nod. "Just speak from the heart, Ellie," he had whispered to me before we went back in. "Let the judge see who you are." I stood and walked towards the witness stand, my legs feeling unsteady. The room was utterly silent. I could feel every eye on me. I sat down, smoothed the fabric of my simple skirt over my knees, and looked directly at Judge Albright. My family refused to meet my gaze. My father was studying a crack in the ceiling. My mother was examining her cuticles. Robert was staring straight ahead, his jaw set. "Miss Vance," the judge said, her voice even. "You have heard the testimony. You have heard your family's concerns. They believe placing your grandmother, Mrs. Miller, in a professional care facility and selling her primary asset, the farm, is the most responsible course of action. They have presented a compelling case based on medical and financial data. Now, I would like to hear from you. Why do you believe you should be granted guardianship and that your grandmother should remain in her home, under your care?" I took a breath. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "Your Honor," I began, my voice trembling slightly at first. "I am not a doctor. I am not a financial advisor. I can't show you spreadsheets or medical charts that will impress you. All I have are the things that don't fit on a spreadsheet." I paused, gathering my thoughts. My brother and my parents, they see my grandmother as a set of problems to be solved. A medical condition to be managed. A financial burden to be offset. And I understand that. It comes from a place of a certain kind of love. A practical love. But they have forgotten the person. They have forgotten Beatrice. They talk about her assets. For my entire life, my grandmother's greatest asset was her memory. It's the one thing this terrible disease is stealing from her, piece by piece. But the land, Blackwood Creek Farm, that is her memory too. It's a living library of her life. She can walk out onto the porch, the same porch her father built, and something in her remembers. She can touch the rough bark of the old oak tree where my grandfather carved their initials, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crosses her face. These aren't just things, Your Honor. They are anchors. They are lifelines to a self that is slipping away. To take her from that place would be like tearing the last few pages out of her book before the story is over. I spoke for a long time. I didn't argue. I told stories. I told the court about how Beatrice had taught me to bake bread, her hands, dusted with flour, patiently showing me how to knead the dough. I told them about the winter she'd nursed a wounded sparrow back to health in a shoebox by the fire. I told them about the way she would read poetry aloud to the setting sun. I was trying to paint a portrait of the woman, not the patient. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting. The air was no longer sharp with legal maneuvering. It was thick with something else. Nostalgia. Emotion. Mr. Davies, my family's lawyer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My mother had stopped feigning indifference and was watching me, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. My father's gaze was still fixed on the ceiling, but his jaw was clenched even tighter. "My family says I am being sentimental," I continued, my voice growing stronger, clearer. "And they are right. I am. But since when did sentiment become a bad word? Since when did love and memory and keeping a promise become less important than financial sense? My grandmother is not a line item on a balance sheet. She is a person who lived a full and beautiful life, and she deserves to end that life with dignity, in the place she loves, surrounded by the memories that made her who she is. And with a person who loves her not for what she has, but for who she has always been. I looked at my parents then, directly into their eyes. I promised her. When her mind was clear and her voice was strong, I gave her my word. My promise is not a nostalgic, off-the-cuff comment. It is the most important vow I have ever made, and I intend to keep it. I could see the judge was listening, truly listening. Her pen was still. Her eyes were fixed on my face. But I knew stories and sentiment might not be enough. The law was cold and hard. I needed something more. Something concrete. Your Honor, I said, my voice dropping a little. If I may, I brought something with me. I gestured to the cardboard box by my chair. Judge Albright nodded. I bent down and lifted the box, placing it on my lap. It was an old, dusty thing that had once held Christmas ornaments. I opened the lid. The scent of lavender and old paper wafted out. Inside was a chaotic jumble of Beatrice's life. Old photographs with deckled edges. A baby's shoe. A small, velvet-covered book of poetry. A bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. My family saw the box and their expressions soured. I could almost hear their thoughts. Here she goes again. More emotional clutter. My hands trembled as I sifted through the contents. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. I just knew that the answer had to be in here somewhere, in the tangible remnants of my grandmother's world. I pulled out photographs, showing the judge a black and white picture of Beatrice and my grandfather on their wedding day, radiating youth and hope. I showed her a picture of my brother and me as children, sitting on the porch swing with her, our faces smeared with ice cream. This is who we are talking about, I said softly. This woman. And then my fingers brushed against it. It wasn't in the bundle of letters from my grandfather. It was separate, tucked into the side of the box, inside a thick, yellowed envelope. It was addressed simply to my Eleanor. My heart stopped. I didn't remember this letter. Her handwriting was different. It was shakier than in her younger days, but still elegant, still distinctly hers. I carefully slid the letter from the envelope. It was several pages long, written on her favorite lilac-colored stationery. May I read this, Your Honor? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Judge Albright leaned forward slightly. Please, Miss Vance. I cleared my throat and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means my mind has started its long journey away from me, and you are likely in the middle of a difficult time. I am writing this today on my 89th birthday, while the sun is shining and my thoughts are as clear as the water in Blackwood Creek. I am writing this because I know your father and your brother. I love them, but they see the world through a different lens than you and I. They see logic and numbers, and they will call it sense. You and I, we see the heart of things, and they will call it sentiment. I had to pause to compose myself. I glanced up. The courtroom was utterly still. My mother was openly weeping now, her hand covering her mouth. My father's face had lost its stiffness. It looked stricken. Robert was pale, his confident posture gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. I continued reading. They will try to do what they think is best. They will talk of safety and security and professional care. They will want to sell the farm, believing its value is in the money it can bring. They do not understand that its true value is in the soil, in the memories it holds. They do not understand that my soul is tied to this place. Eleanor, you are the one who understands. You have always been the one who listened, not just with your ears, but with your heart. You were never the daughter who brought home trophies or accolades, but you were the one who brought me wildflowers. You were the one who saw the beauty in the ordinary, just as I do. So I am putting this in writing as clearly as I can. It is my most fervent wish, my final directive, that I live out the remainder of my days, no matter how clouded my mind becomes, in my home at Blackwood Creek Farm. I do not want to be in a facility, no matter how fine. I want my own bed, my own porch, my own sky. And I want you, my dear Eleanor, to be the one to see to it. I know the burden I am asking you to carry is immense. It will be hard, but I trust you. I trust your strength, which has always been a quiet strength, the kind that endures. I trust your love. I am legally appointing you my durable power of attorney for healthcare in this letter, a copy of which is also with my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, but I know the legal papers are not what will guide you. You will be guided by the promise you made me, the promise I know you will keep. She had signed it, with all my love, your Grandma Beatrice. And at the bottom, it was dated, notarized, and witnessed by her old lawyer, who had passed away 2 years prior. It was her voice, clear and irrefutable, reaching across the fog of her illness to speak the truth in this cold, sterile room. I folded the letter, my hands shaking. The silence was profound. It was broken only by my mother's quiet sobs. I looked at the judge. Tears were glistening in her eyes. She took off her glasses and wiped them slowly with a handkerchief. She looked at my family's lawyer, Mr. Davies, who simply stood, opened his mouth, and then closed it again. He had nothing left to say. He sat down, defeated. Judge Albright put her glasses back on. She looked at my parents and my brother, her expression no longer just kind, but filled with a deep, maternal wisdom. In my years on this bench, she said, her voice resonating with quiet authority, I have seen families torn apart by money and property. I have heard countless arguments about what is logical and what is responsible, but I have rarely witnessed such a powerful testament to the true meaning of care. It is not just about keeping a body safe. It is about honoring a life. It is about preserving dignity. She looked at me. Miss Vance, your grandmother was a very wise woman. She knew her family well. She knew who to trust not just with her assets, but with her very soul. She picked up her gavel. The petition for guardianship filed by Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Margaret Miller and Mr. Robert Miller is hereby denied. Based on the clear and legally binding directive presented in this letter, as well as the deeply compelling testimony of her character and wishes, this court grants full guardianship and healthcare proxy to her granddaughter, Ms. Eleanor Vance. The management of Mrs. Beatrice Miller's estate, including Blackwood Creek Farm, is to remain under her purview, to be used for the express purpose of her in-home care as she wished. This court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel striking the wood block was like a thunderclap in the silent room. It was over. I had won. But as I sat there, the letter clutched in my hand, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a vast, aching emptiness. I had won the battle, but I looked across the room and knew I had lost my family. My father wouldn't look at me. He stood up stiffly and helped my mother to her feet, his face a mask of stone. Robert gathered his papers, his movements jerky and angry. They walked out of the courtroom without a single glance in my direction. The eye roll of the morning had been replaced by a wall of shame and resentment that felt infinitely higher and colder. Walking out of the courthouse felt like stepping into a different world. The sun was bright, the city noise was loud, but everything felt muted and distant. My lawyer patted my shoulder. You did it, Ellie. You really did it. I gave him a weak smile, but the joy wouldn't come. The victory was hollow, tainted by the image of my family's backs as they walked away from me. I drove back to the farm, the journey a blur of green fields and blue sky. When I pulled up the gravel driveway, the old house looked the same as it always had. Welcoming, tired, real. I walked inside. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My caregiver for the day, a kind woman named Sarah, was sitting with Beatrice in the living room, looking at a picture book. Beatrice looked up as I entered, her eyes vacant for a moment. Then a flicker. Ellie, she said, her voice a fragile wisp. You're home. I'm home, Grandma, I said, my voice breaking. I knelt beside her chair and took her hand. It felt frail, but familiar. Safe. The days that followed turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Caring for her was not easy. There were hard days, days filled with confusion and frustration, when she didn't know who I was and cried for a mother who had been gone for 70 years. There were long nights when she would wander the halls, and I would gently guide her back to bed, my own body aching with fatigue. My parents did not call. Robert sent a single, terse email, arranging to have some of his old things picked up from the attic. The silence from them was a constant, low-level hum of pain in the background of my life. But there were also moments of pure, unadulterated grace. There were afternoons when we would sit on the porch swing together, not speaking, just watching the swallows dip and soar over the fields. There were times when a song would come on the radio, and she would hum along, a perfect, clear memory from a life I could only imagine. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, she turned to me. Her eyes were lucid, as clear as they had been on the day I made my promise. She squeezed my hand. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered. "Thank you, Eleanor, for bringing the sunset to me." In that moment, the courtroom, the legal battle, the pained rift with my family, it all faded away. The spreadsheets and the logic and the sensible arguments of my brother meant nothing. The rolled eyes of my parents were a distant, insignificant memory. All that mattered was this: the warmth of her hand in mine, the peace on her face, the quiet dignity of a promise kept. The legal battle was over, but the journey of love and memory, that was a path I would walk with her, one quiet step at a time, until the very end. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had chosen the heart of things, and it had been the right choice all along. The summer of the trial bled into autumn, and the fiery colors of the maples outside the farmhouse window seemed to mirror the burning intensity of my new life. The legal victory, which had once seemed like the final peak of a mountain, was just the beginning of a much longer, more arduous climb. Life with Grandma Beatrice became a rhythm of small moments, a delicate dance between the present and the past. My days were measured not in hours, but in doses of medication, in successful spoonfuls of food, in the brief, shining moments of clarity that would break through the fog of her dementia like sunlight through heavy clouds. There was a profound and quiet beauty to it all, a beauty I clung to with every fiber of my being. I learned the new language of her illness. I learned that when she'd ask for the blue cup, she meant the one with the chipped rim that my grandfather had always used. I learned that when she'd pace the hallway at dusk, it was because a part of her was waiting for the cows to come home, even though the pasture had been empty for 30 years. I learned that the scent of lavender calmed her anxieties, and that the sound of my late husband David's old folk music albums could sometimes coax a smile from her when nothing else would. These were the things no medical chart could ever capture, the intimate details that formed the tapestry of her life, a tapestry I was now solely responsible for keeping from unraveling completely. But the isolation was a heavy cloak. My phone, which had once buzzed with family obligations and my mother's perfunctory check-ins, was now mostly silent. The void left by my parents and my brother was a palpable presence in the old house. Some days, the silence was a relief, reprieve from the judgment and criticism. On other days, it was a crushing weight. I would find myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the phone on the wall, my hand hovering over the receiver, a desperate urge to just hear my mother's voice, even if it was tinged with disappointment. I never made the call. Their absence was a clear message. I had made my choice, and I was to live with it alone. The financial reality of my decision began to set in as the days grew shorter. Robert's words from the courtroom echoed in my mind: financially responsible. The farm, beautiful as it was, cost money to run. The property taxes were looming, the old furnace was making a terrifying rattling sound, and Beatrice's medications and the salary for Sarah, my part-time caregiver, were draining my savings at an alarming rate. I had David's pension and my small retirement fund, but I was burning through it far faster than I had planned. One crisp October evening, I sat at the old oak dining table, bills spread out before me like a losing hand of cards. The numbers swam before my eyes. The red ink of a past due notice on the heating oil bill felt like a brand. For the first time since the trial, a cold sliver of panic pierced my resolve. Could I really do this? Was their logic, however cold, ultimately correct? I walked out to the barn that night, the one place on the farm that felt entirely mine. The air was cold and smelled of hay and earth. I leaned against a rough-hewn support beam, the same one I used to hide behind as a child, and let the tears I had been holding back for weeks finally fall. They were tears of exhaustion, of loneliness, of fear. I was angry at my family for abandoning me, but a part of me was also angry at myself for my pride. Had I been so determined to prove them wrong that I had doomed both myself and my grandmother? I missed David with an ache that was sharp and fresh. He would have known what to do. He would have held my hand, looked at the bills, and said, "We'll figure it out, Ellie." We always do. But I was alone now. It was just me, the leaning barn, and the immense, terrifying weight of my promise. The next day, I made a decision. I drove into town and went to a small, quiet jewelry shop. I took off the sapphire necklace David had given me for our 20th anniversary. It was my most treasured possession. The jeweler, a kind old man who had known my grandparents, looked at me with sad eyes as he weighed it. He gave me a fair price, a sum that would keep the furnace running through the winter and cover Sarah's salary for another few months. As I walked out of the shop, the cash felt heavy and dirty in my pocket. My neck felt bare and cold. That night, as I helped Beatrice get ready for bed, she touched the hollow at my throat. "Your sparkles are gone," she said, her voice small and confused. "I know, Grandma," I whispered, my heart clenching. "It's okay. We don't need them right now." She seemed to accept that and drifted off to sleep, but I lay awake for hours, feeling the loss of more than just a piece of jewelry. I had sacrificed a piece of my past to pay for our present. Life continued in its new, difficult rhythm. The furnace was fixed. The taxes were paid. But the fundamental problem remained. The farm was a beloved home, but it was not an income source. I started looking for ways to make it one. I remembered Beatrice's wildflower field, the one she had always insisted was so valuable. I spent my evenings researching online, learning about artisanal honey and organic flower farming. It was a faint glimmer of a plan, a seed of an idea born from desperation. I started small, harvesting lavender and drying it, making small sachets that I sold at the local farmers market on Saturdays when Sarah could stay with Beatrice. The income was negligible, a drop in an ocean of debt, but it was something. It was me fighting back. It was me trying to be the practical one, the sensible one in my own way. It was on one of these Saturdays, a cold, gray afternoon in late November, that everything changed. I was returning from the market, my car smelling of lavender and damp earth, feeling weary but a little hopeful after selling a few dozen sachets. As I turned into the driveway, I saw it. A clean, sensible sedan, a model my father favored, was parked near the front porch. My heart leaped into my throat. I parked my own car and got out, my legs feeling weak. The front door opened before I reached it. It was my mother, Margaret. She stood there, looking smaller and older than I remembered, bundled in a camel-colored coat that seemed too formal for the rustic setting. Her expression was a complicated mixture of anxiety and resolve. "Eleanor," she said, her voice quiet. It lacked its usual critical edge. "Mother," I replied, my voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "Your father doesn't know I've come," she said quickly, as if that were the most important detail. "Robert doesn't either. I spoke to Carol Henderson at the market last week. She told me you were selling things." The way she said it was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, tinged with something I couldn't quite decipher. Shame, perhaps. Or worry. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there on the porch steps, the cold wind whipping strands of hair across my face. She looked past me into the house. "How is she?" "She's having a good day," I said. "Sarah's with her." An awkward silence fell between us, a chasm filled with months of unspoken anger and hurt. I expected a lecture. I expected an "I told you so." I expected her to tell me to give up, to call Robert, to admit defeat. Instead, she just looked at my face, her gaze lingering on the dark circles under my eyes. "You look tired, Eleanor," she said softly. "I am tired," I admitted. The simple admission felt like a monumental concession. She stepped aside, a silent invitation for me to enter my own home. I walked past her into the warmth of the house. From the living room, I could hear Sarah's gentle voice and Beatrice's occasional, soft laugh. My mother followed me into the kitchen. She took off her coat and draped it carefully over the back of a chair, as if performing a familiar ritual in a foreign land. She looked around the kitchen, at the stack of dishes by the sink I hadn't gotten to, at the list of reminders I'd scribbled on a notepad. Her gaze was clinical, assessing. I braced myself for the critique. Carol said you sold your necklace, she said, her back to me as she stared out the window at the bleak November landscape. I needed the money for the heating oil, I said, my voice defensive. She turned around, and for the first time, I saw that her eyes were red-rimmed. Your father and I, we are not monsters, Eleanor. We never wanted you to be in this position. Then why did you leave me in it? I shot back, the anger I had suppressed for so long finally bubbling to the surface. Why did you walk out of that courtroom and never look back? You left me completely alone to handle this. You had no idea what it would be like, did you? You just assumed I'd fail, and you couldn't bear to watch. The truth of the words hung between us. She didn't deny it. She just sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. I didn't know what to do, she whispered, looking down at her hands, which were twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Your father, he was so angry, so humiliated. He said you made a fool of us. And Robert. Robert took it as a personal failure. They shut down. And I just went along with it. It was easier. Easier? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. It was easier to cut your daughter out of your life? To abandon your own mother? No, she said, looking up, her eyes pleading. No, it wasn't easy. It's been awful. Every day. I lie awake at night, and I think of you here. I think of her. Just then, a sound drifted from the living room. Beatrice had started to sing. It was a fragmented, off-key version of You Are My Sunshine. It was the song she used to sing to me and Robert when we were children. My mother froze, listening. Her face crumpled. A single tear traced a path down her carefully powdered cheek. She used to sing that to you both, she said, her voice thick. I nodded, unable to speak. The song, a simple, sweet melody, was doing what months of anger and silence could not. It was breaking down the walls between us. My mother stood up and walked tentatively towards the living room. I followed. We stood in the doorway together, watching. Beatrice was sitting in her favorite armchair, a colorful quilt over her lap. She was looking out the window, but her eyes were far away, lost in the song. Sarah saw us and gave a small, understanding smile before quietly excusing herself to the kitchen. My mother walked slowly into the room and knelt by Beatrice's chair, much as I had done on the day of the trial. Mother, she said softly. Beatrice stopped singing and turned her head. She looked at my mother, her brow furrowed in concentration. She stared for a long moment, and my heart ached, knowing she likely wouldn't recognize her own daughter. But then, a glimmer of something appeared in her eyes. Not full recognition, but a deep, instinctual knowing. She reached out a trembling hand and touched my mother's cheek. Oh, Margaret, she said, her voice surprisingly clear. Don't you cry. He's just a man. He gets angry, but his heart is good. He'll come around. My mother let out a strangled sob. Beatrice wasn't seeing her daughter, the 60-year-old woman kneeling before her. She was seeing a much younger Margaret at a new bride, perhaps upset after a fight with my father. She was offering comfort across a 50-year divide. In that moment, Beatrice wasn't the patient. She was the mother again, tending to her child's heart. I watched as my mother leaned her head against her mother's knee and wept. Not the controlled, dignified dabs of a tissue I saw in the courtroom, but deep, shoulder-shaking sobs of grief and regret. Beatrice simply stroked her hair, humming You Are My Sunshine under her breath, her own mind having already moved on from the moment of clarity, now just offering wordless, instinctual comfort. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, my own tears falling silently. The house was no longer filled with the ghosts of my family. A part of it, broken and hurting, had finally come home. The rift wasn't healed, not by a long shot. My father and Robert were still out there, locked in their pride. But as I stood there, listening to the kettle whistle and the sound of my grandmother humming to my weeping mother, I felt a flicker of hope. The victory in the courtroom had saved the farm. But maybe, just maybe, this broken, beautiful, difficult life we were living within its walls had a chance to save us, too. The kettle's whistle was a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the thick emotion in the house. My mother didn't move from her spot on the floor, her head still resting on Beatrice's knee, her body shaking with silent sobs. Beatrice, lost in her own world, continued to hum, her hand a steady, rhythmic presence in my mother's hair. It was a strange and sacred tableau, 3 generations of women, locked in a moment of pain, comfort, and profound, complicated love. I poured hot water over 2 tea bags in chipped porcelain mugs, my hands moving with an autonomy my mind couldn't muster. This was not the reunion I had ever imagined. There were no dramatic apologies, no grand gestures of forgiveness. There was only this raw, unfiltered moment of shared humanity, brought on by a nursery rhyme and the ghost of a memory. I carried the mugs into the living room. My mother had composed herself slightly, sitting up and wiping her face with the now damp handkerchief. She looked exhausted, as if she had just completed a long and arduous journey. I handed her a mug, and her cold fingers brushed against mine. "Thank you, Eleanor," she murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. We sat there in silence for a long time, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and Beatrice's soft, intermittent humming. The chasm between my mother and me hadn't vanished, but a fragile, tentative bridge had begun to form across it. "I didn't understand," she finally said, staring into her tea. We thought keeping her safe was the most important thing. The only thing. We saw the falls, the confusion, the risks. We saw it all as a failure of the environment. Of you. We never stopped to think that this environment, this very house, was the only thing holding the pieces of her together. She took a shaky sip of tea. When Robert showed us the brochures for Evergreen Meadows, it all looked so clean, so efficient. It looked like a solution. A way to solve the problem of her getting old. We didn't want to see the mess. The reality of it. It was easier to write a check. "It's not easy, Mother," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done." "I know that now," she replied, and this time she did look at me. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen since I was a little girl who had fallen and scraped her knee, genuine, unadulterated maternal concern. "What you said in the courtroom, about the promise. Your father and Robert dismissed it as sentiment. But hearing her, just now, seeing this, I realized it wasn't just a promise to her. It was a promise to honor her life. We were so busy trying to manage her death. The next few hours were a careful dance of reconciliation. She didn't offer empty platitudes or try to erase the past months of silence. Instead, she asked questions. She asked about Beatrice's routines, her medications, what foods she liked now, what stories she still told. She listened, really listened, for the first time. As evening fell and Sarah's shift ended, my mother insisted on helping me prepare a simple supper. We moved around the kitchen, a space she had always criticized for its outdated appliances and cluttered counters. But tonight, she didn't criticize. She washed vegetables. She set the table. These small, domestic acts were more powerful than any apology. They were acts of service, acts of presence. When it was time for her to leave, we stood on the porch in the cold, dark air. "I have to talk to your father," she said, her voice laced with apprehension. "And Robert." "I don't know what will happen, Eleanor. They are proud men." "I know," I said. She reached into her purse and pulled out her checkbook. "Please, let me help." "For the furnace, for..." I gently placed my hand over hers, stopping her. "Not yet, Mother. You're being here today. That's the help I needed most." She nodded, a fresh wave of tears in her eyes. "I'll be back," she said. "On Tuesday, if that's all right." "That's all right," I said, and watched as the sensible sedan's taillights disappeared down the long, dark driveway, leaving me once again in the quiet solitude of the farm, but this time, it felt a little less lonely. My mother kept her word. Tuesday came, and so did she. And the Tuesday after that. She would arrive with groceries we didn't always need and spend the afternoons sitting with Beatrice, reading to her from the old book of poetry I'd found in the memory box. She learned the rhythm of our days. She learned to interpret the fragmented sentences, to soothe the moments of agitation. She saw the exhaustion in my face and would insist I go take a nap or simply take a walk by the creek alone. She was slowly, painstakingly, re-earning her place not just as my mother, but as Beatrice's daughter. The phone call about my father came on a Saturday. My mother's voice was strained. He knows, Ellie. He is, beside himself. He said I'm undermining him, that I'm encouraging your foolishness. Robert called, quoted some article about caregiver burnout, said we were both being irresponsible. They want me to stop coming. Are you going to? I asked, my heart sinking. There was a pause, and then I heard her take a deep, steadying breath. No, she said, with a firmness I'd never heard from her before. No, I am not. I told your father that for 30 years, I have deferred to his judgment on almost everything. But not on this. This is about my mother. I will not abandon her, and I will not abandon you. It was a declaration of independence I never thought I would hear. The woman who had clutched her purse like a shield in the courtroom had finally put it down and picked up a sword. Her defiance did not heal the rift. In many ways, it widened it. My father and Robert doubled down on their silence. It became a Cold War, with my mother and me on one side, and the men of the family on the other, entrenched in their fortress of logic and pride. But having an ally transformed my world. The crushing weight of responsibility was now shared, and with two pairs of hands, things that had seemed impossible began to feel achievable. My mother, with her garden club connections, saw the potential in my fledgling lavender business. Eleanor, she said one day, looking out at the sprawling, wild meadow. These aren't just flowers. They're a gold mine. Together, we researched. We learned about native species, about the demand for organic, locally sourced florals for weddings and events. My sentimental appreciation for the wildflowers and her practical, social connections combined to form a real business plan. We named it Beatrice's Bloom. It felt right. Her love for the land would be the very thing that saved it. We started small, with a contract to provide weekly arrangements for a local boutique hotel. The work was hard. We were up at dawn, our hands stained with dirt, our backs aching. But we were working together, building something new from something old. For the first time in my life, my mother looked at me not with disappointment, but with admiration. One sweltering afternoon in July, nearly a year after the trial, a sleek, expensive car I recognized pulled into the driveway. It was Robert. He got out, dressed in a crisp business shirt and tailored trousers, looking profoundly out of place amidst the rustic chaos of our burgeoning flower business. He stood for a moment, watching my mother and me as we sorted bunches of Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans on a long table under the shade of the oak tree. Mother. Eleanor, he said, his voice stiff. Father asked me to come. He's worried. He thinks this little hobby is going to bankrupt you both. I felt a flash of the old anger, the familiar sting of his condescension. But it was different now. I was different. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to him. It's not a hobby, Robert. It's a business. He scoffed, a faint, disbelieving sound. A business? Selling weeds from a field. I didn't argue. I simply went into the house and returned with a ledger. The same kind of ledger he revered. I opened it on the table, my finger tracing the columns. This is our contract with the Stone Creek Inn. This is our standing order with Ever After events. These are our invoices. And this, I said, tapping the final column, is our net profit for the last quarter. It's not your world, Robert. It won't make us rich. But it paid the property taxes, it covers all of Grandma's expenses, and it's turning a profit. The farm is paying for itself. He stared at the ledger, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a man of numbers, and the numbers did not lie. He looked from the ledger to me, to our mother, to the fields vibrant with color, to the old farmhouse that was no longer just a liability, but the headquarters of a thriving enterprise. He saw not sentiment, but strategy. Not a foolish dream, but a sustainable reality. The logical framework through which he viewed the world had been presented with data it could not refute. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he was wrong. He just shook his head slightly, muttered something about having to get back, and left. But as he drove away, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I had finally spoken to him in the only language he truly understood. The seasons turned. The flower business flourished. The house was filled with the scent of blooms and the quiet hum of purpose. Beatrice continued her slow, gentle fade. The moments of agitation became fewer, replaced by a deep, peaceful calm. Most days she sat in her chair, a silent observer of the life bustling around her. But sometimes her eyes would follow me as I moved about the room, and I would feel the deep, unbreakable tether of her love, a connection that dementia could not sever. The end came on a gentle evening in early autumn, 2 years after the trial. The day had been quiet. Beatrice had barely woken, her breathing shallow. The hospice nurse had visited and told us it was time. My mother and I knew what we had to do. We dressed her in her favorite soft nightgown and, with the strength born of love and desperation, we helped her out to the porch swing. We bundled her in her oldest, softest quilt. My mother called my father. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's time. You need to come now. You need to be here." We sat on the swing, Beatrice between us, her head resting on my shoulder. The sun was beginning its descent, a fiery orb in a sky streaked with violet and rose. We didn't speak. We just sat, holding her hands, listening to the crickets begin their evening song. A car crunched on the gravel. It was my father. He walked towards the porch, his steps slow, hesitant. He looked old and frail, his usual confident posture gone. He stopped at the steps, his face a mess of pride and grief. "Arthur," my mother said softly. He walked up the steps and stood before Beatrice. She stirred, her eyes opening just a slit. They were cloudy, unfocused. She didn't know him. But her hand, the one I wasn't holding, lifted slightly, reaching into the space between them. My father looked at her hand, then at my mother, then at me. And then he crumpled. All the anger, all the pride, all the rigid certainty, dissolved in an instant. He sat down on the old wicker chair opposite the swing and took her hand, his shoulders shaking as he finally let himself weep. We sat there, the four of us, a broken family pieced back together by the quiet, inexorable power of love and loss. We watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the wildflower field in a final, golden light. Beatrice took a soft, gentle breath, and then, a moment later, she let it go. And she was gone. My promise was kept. She had seen her last sunset from her porch, surrounded by the land she loved, and held by the family she had made. At the funeral, the church was filled with flowers from her field. It was a celebration, a testament to a life lived with grace and a spirit that had bloomed even in the rockiest of soil. After the service, Robert found me. He looked humbled, his eyes filled with a sorrow that was new to him. "Ellie," he began, his voice thick. "I was so wrong. I saw a problem that needed a logical solution, and I completely missed the person who needed love. What you did, it was the most logical thing of all. You saved her. And I think, in the end, you saved all of us. I'm so sorry." I simply nodded, and for the first time in our adult lives, my brother hugged me. A year has passed. I am sitting on the porch swing, the wood warmed by the afternoon sun. The farm is more alive than ever. Beatrice's bloom is my life's work now, my purpose. My mother is my business partner, her laughter a frequent sound in the old house. My father comes over on weekends. He doesn't say much, but he mends fences, fixes leaky faucets, and brings me tools for the garden. It is his language of love, and I have finally learned to understand it. The house is still full of Beatrice's memories, but they are no longer ghosts. They're a comforting presence, a reminder of the strength and love that are soaked into the very walls of this place. My parents never rolled their eyes at me again. In their gaze, I now see respect and a kind of awe. I was the sentimental daughter, the impractical dreamer. But it was that sentiment that saw the true value of a field of weeds, that understood the solemnity of a promise, that knew a person's soul was worth more than the logic of a spreadsheet. The judge in the courtroom had been surprised that day, but no one was more surprised than my own family. And in the end, no one was more surprised than me. I had fought for my grandmother's life, and in doing so, I had finally, truly found my own.